Welcome to this edition of Great Books, a lively discussion of a selection from the canon of exceptional literature. Here's your host, Jack Hatfield.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us for the Great Books Show. I'm Jack Hatfield. Our panel meets monthly to discuss great works of classic and modern literature. Today we're discussing The Indestructibility of Our Inner Nature by Schopenhauer. Jake will introduce the work. Jake?
Arthur Schopenhauer was born in Danzig, Germany, today's Gdansk, Poland, in 1788. He died in 1869 as the shadows of civil war lengthened over the United States. When he was a teenager, his father, a successful businessman, died, apparently a suicide. His relations with his mother seem always to have been strained and finally eventuated in a total estrangement. Schopenhauer's early education was a somewhat unconventional mix of homeschooling, tutoring, and travel. After his father's death, Schopenhauer entered the University of Göttingen as a med student, studying, among other things, physics, chemistry, and botany. However, his reading of Plato and Kant soon captured him for philosophy. He transferred to the University of Berlin and eventually to Jena, where he completed his doctorate in 1813. Schopenhauer then began lecturing at the University of Berlin, but he was largely overshadowed by the more popular and less pessimistic Hegel, whose philosophy he strongly opposed. Nonetheless, while there, he managed to complete his major work, The World as Will and Idea, sometimes translated The World as Will and Representation. It was published in 1919 and was pretty much ignored. In the last decade of his life, he began to receive recognition in European universities and in England, the USA, and Russia. After his death, his influence extended to Freud, Nietzsche, and others. Schopenhauer espouses a naturalistic, empirically based philosophy strongly influenced by Eastern ideas. He believed that death was the inspiring genius of philosophy. Further, he believed that nature provides a remedy for every evil, including fear of death. Accordingly, he thought that the proper approach to the subject lay not in untenable Western doctrines of annihilation or resurrection, but rather in a higher standpoint grounded in the indestructibility of our inner nature. Our discussion on this subject is drawn from Volume 2 of E.F.J. Payne's translation of The World as Will and Representation. It draws heavily on a Buddhist understanding of the underlying nature of reality to elaborate on his view of the liberating meaning of death for the individual consciousness.
My first question has to do with death. That seems to be very important to Schopenhauer. He says in his first sentence, he says, death is the real inspiring genius of philosophy. Why do you think he says that, besides being a very negative person?
Well, he starts talking about animals and says that animals don't know death, but men, once they got reason, they understood that they were facing death. And how do you live a life when you face death? You have to come up with some reason to make sense of things, and that's what philosophy does.
Okay, anybody else?
Well, I think he said not only philosophy, religion and philosophy are created because of death. If we were immortal, we wouldn't ask the big questions. What is life after death is one of the big questions man is asking himself. Why are we here? What's our purpose? All those big questions. He doesn't assert it, but I think he's saying if death didn't exist, we wouldn't be asking those questions. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
I think you still ask some of those questions, like what's our purpose? Why are we here? How should we live? But definitely a big one is how do we deal with death?
And what's life? Is there a life hereafter? That's another big.
Is it, or that's what today's
people.
selection
Not
is
for
about?
him. He said no.
Pardon me? Not for him.
Well, let me switch here. The title is The Indestructibility of Our Inner Nature. What argument does he put forth to prove that?
I think he's saying the will to live is so strong that it's not knowledge that gives us that. We're inborn with that feeling, the will to live.
How does that tie into indestructibility of our inner nature?
You ask hard questions.
He says that the will to live is the innermost essence of man. And then he goes on to explain, if an outsider was looking at the world, they would see creatures being born and creatures dying and creatures being born and living their lives and dying, but it would just be like waves on this unchanging landscape where species don't change and the universe just goes on forever. And therefore, what is an individual? It's not really important. What's important is the species. And where does the species come from? Well, we're part of it, but it exists after we die. And so therefore, there's part of us that lives on. And it's this will to live and will to create progeny and future generations is what I got.
He believes the will is the basic underlying reality that holds everything together. That's the structure, and it's one. That's why he likes the East so much. You know, will is the energy at the heart of things, and it represents everything that we see. Matter, I mean, individual is a representation. You know, and so you got two realities where you got phenomena, which is our experience, then you've got will down there at the bottom, which we sort of get to know, but never really know. We just know it's there.
Yeah, and he says there's this being that goes throughout the universe and is
the will
expressed in us by that will to live.
But
well, the will to live forces everything. Every matter, every organism is an idea or a representation of the will. An individual is a representation of the will. The things that we experience are representations of the phenomena all around us. You know, phenomena are representations of the will, and they go on and on and on and recycle.
One of his comments here is the fear of death is, in fact, independent of all knowledge, for the animal has it, although it does not know death. Everything that is born already brings this fear into the world. Such fear of death, however, is a priori, only the reverse side of the will to live, which indeed we all are.
And that's the only argument he gives for the will being the underlying reality.
Right.
But he makes
the question you asked first.
Yeah, the point he's making, and I don't understand it, he's taking that we all have an essence that's common. It's kind of there's a universal consciousness. Didn't use that term, but I think that's what he's getting
No,
at.
there's no universal consciousness. Well, there is in a way. That's where the structure of phenomenon comes from. We all have ideas, and they more or less coincide because we all got the same mental structure.
I think he's saying more than that. I think he's saying there's something in us that we share with absolutely every living thing.
Yeah, will. We're a representation of the underlying will.
Yeah, on the first page, he talks about Brahmanism and Buddhism, which teach man to regard himself as Brahman as the original being himself, right? So I think he did mention that being, but then he drops that and just talks about this will to live. And he also talks about Mother Nature as if, well, not Mother Nature, but nature, as if nature has an existence.
Okay.
Every organism is a representation of the will. And nature is a name for all of this, all the representations of the will that we perceive in our consciousness. And consciousness itself is just something that the will uses to gratify its impulses, or, you know, make its choices and do,
You know, we
at least
said
that's how I read it.
He doesn't believe in any life after death. But on page 11, he says, do not consider death the cessation of life.
Right.
He isn't.
Right.
But he doesn't
How do
believe
you
in
put those two together?
consciousness after death.
That he's saying that this I don't like the word will to it, but that's what he uses.
Yeah.
This whatever you want to call it, will, that exists forever. That does not die.
Yeah.
Just our physical being is what dies.
But he said, another place he says, the world goes away, but your ego stays. I'm not sure I'm quoting it correctly.
I thought
No, he
that
doesn't
was
say
very
that.
confusing too when he
Individual is
talks
a
about
phenomenon.
that.
The individual passes away. He talks about you're nothing before and nothing after. But the will that, for a while, will you, is still there, and that part is a part that doesn't.
The will is still there after
Yeah.
existence is gone?
Sure, that's permanent. It never changes. It comes, it's the forms and the states and everything. It's a process.
Yeah, the quote he's having difficulty with is, the terrors of death,
What page?
18, the bottom paragraph.
Yeah.
The terrors of death rest for the most part on the false illusion that then the I or ego vanishes and the world remains, but rather is the opposite true.
Right.
Namely, that the world vanishes. On the other hand, the innermost kernel of the ego endures.
Yeah. No.
And I read that several times
Yes.
too. And then I think he goes on to talk about the world as represented in our brain disappears because our intelligence disappears. But that
Then there are individual worlds.
inner part of ourselves goes on, that there's another world that remains in somebody else's head, but the world that we had in our head doesn't exist anymore because our consciousness is gone.
Right.
That's all that's left of us is that will.
Yeah.
Right. So he also says on page 10, for consciousness has always shown itself to me not as the cause, but as a product and a result of organic life, since it rose and sank in consequences thereof at different periods of life.
That's right.
So consciousness, we don't have consciousness dealing with the organ itself. The organ has created the consciousness.
What did you think of this concept when he said, we fear death because once we live, we have existence, but there's non-existence. But if we fear that, well, how come we don't fear non-existence before we were born? You remember that one?
Sure.
Yes. It says it's irrational not to.
Doesn't he
Okay.
get the point that we had existence before non-existent? But when we weren't born, we didn't have existence before that. We lose life. We don't lose life before we had existence.
But
Am I confusing?
He made a point. He was living in a world. Remember the science of his time, because he studied physics and chemistry, and the science of his time was that the universe always existed the way it existed, and all the species existed, and the world existed, and it was unchanging. They hadn't found the first dinosaur bone to find out the species were extinct. They didn't know about the Big Bang. He said that there was an infinity of time before
Right.
you were born, and there's going to be an infinity of time after your death.
Right.
And if you feel sorry that you're not going to be alive in the future, why aren't you sorry that you weren't
in the
alive
past?
in the past?
Exactly.
He also made fun. He made a little joke of people who actually believed that things had a beginning. And now we find out most scientists think that the universe did have a beginning from this small thing. Maybe that existence for a long time.
Well, that's our idea.
I don't think that has anything to do with it because
because he made fun of beginnings. He said,
He's talking about
nothing
people.
beginnings.
I think
And
what he
beginnings
was...
of life, beginning of species, beginning of the universe.
Yeah, but the will
He
was
has all
always
of it.
there, and it goes in circles.
But he's also talking about the Judeo-Christian view of the West.
Yeah, he disagrees
Okay,
with that.
Exactly.
Yes,
That's why
that
he
people
brings, if you read anything in Buddhism or Hinduism, they have that same thought, that's reincarnation. You existed before, you live in the moment now, and you exist afterwards. So that concept is not native to Western thought. That's a different thought process, and that's what he's bringing into this.
And he's talking about our individual, and I think it's true that people are very afraid of nothing exist when they die. I mean, and annihilation. They're afraid of that. And he's saying, well, there was nothing before you were born. Why aren't you afraid of that?
But he also makes a point, if you get old, you gradually withdraw
Fade
from
away.
life,
Yeah.
and you don't experience things, you don't have big emotions, and eventually you just drift away to death.
Well,
It's
some of
no
that-
big
but
deal.
that's-
You return to the
Okay.
womb of nature, is
Yeah.
his
Right, but that's
expression.
part of the Hindu process when there's
course.
7 stages of life.
But,
and the final
that's just
stage is-
people do that.
Right, yeah.
I had 2 grandmothers that's what they did.
Right.
They
That's
wanted
what
to die.
You and I are doing, but we don't want to die yet.
One thing that I'm looking for the exact quote here, but he's very pessimistic. And he says something like, everyone feels that this life is so bad and they're looking for a better life afterwards. If somebody wasn't pessimistic, if someone really enjoyed their life, does this whole philosophy fall apart?
But he thinks it's impossible for you to enjoy your life, is what the impression
yeah,
I guess.
Yeah.
Well, he
Attachment
says
to
life
life
is a
appears-
bad joke.
Yeah.
Right.
Could
I
be.
mean, yeah, what you talk about pessimist. Life is a bad joke. And then I think he also says knowledge teaches us that life is worthless.
Attachment to life appears
Well, it could be a
foolish.
dream. Yeah,
So
well,
are you?
Knowledge just goes as life's worthlessness.
So we're saying that if you say life can be wonderful and you don't want to leave it after you die, and his whole philosophy would fall apart.
I don't know anything more precious and sacred than life.
Okay, but
yeah, but he
he has
does.
a
He
different.
does.
Okay,
He
never mind.
does. He prefers
Life is a
non-existence.
What's your
representation
bottom
of the
line
will.
question, Jack?
It is. My bottom line question was: if we take the stance that you just said, that life is wonderful and et cetera, does his whole philosophy fall apart? Does he posits that life is pessimistic? If we take away and change that assumption, does everything else fall apart then?
Are you
that's
afraid to go to sleep at night? Young children are afraid to go to sleep at night.
Well, there's things under the bed.
Well, yeah,
Because he says sleep is the mother of death.
Right, and so he's bringing this to the fore, that when you go to sleep every night, you're basically dying to the world on the basis that you think you're going to wake up the next morning. So in the process of sleeping, you're not conscious of what's going on around you.
Yeah, and he talks about death as the species,
Right.
But when he,
going to sleep because it not reincarnates, but recurs in the
Bears
endless
hibernate,
cycle.
right, yeah. So they come back.
Well, yeah, but he's talking about the species. You
Right,
know,
yes.
Nature doesn't care about the individual. That's just
Right.
a quality of the will.
Let me kind of continue what I was trying to get at there, is that he's so pessimistic, and he seems to be, I'm looking for the quote, that he prefers non-existence over existence.
Yes.
Why not suicide?
Why not?
Will to
Suicide.
live. That's where the will to live
He
comes
said,
in.
I think in the paragraph that he alluded to suicide, he says, we'll talk about that later. So I don't think he ever addressed it.
Well, I think
not
No,
in this
I-
particular
less
reading.
answering.
No. Not in,
Yeah, the will to live won't let you go till it's your time.
Yeah,
is basically what he means, I think. The will to live is always there. It just manifests itself in new forms, which are pretty much the same after you finish the cycle. You
well,
got
how do you account for suicide if the will to live is there? Because
I don't.
think
That's an aberration from the norm.
suicide, they lose the will to live.
Right. It's
Well,
a permanent solution
right.
to a temporary problem.
He said it was a choice that everyone has.
Yeah, you
when
could do
life
it.
is overwhelming and there's lots of pain and illness in it or grief in it, that it's always an out that you can choose. And he also says that people who face death without fighting it are considered courageous.
Courageous. And
And
they're happier, I think he said, because they approach, they
Well,
welcome death.
death is like waking up from a nightmare, is another
Yes,
one of his
right,
quotes,
right.
right? And people, after they die, they usually look happy. I thought
Yeah.
that was because their muscles
or
relaxed,
peaceful.
not because they were actually happy.
I think some of them, that's immaterial.
Well, he also gets Freudian on page 19. He says egoism really consists in man's restricting all reality to his own person.
That's right.
And that he imagines he lives in this alone and not in others. Death teaches him something better, since it abolishes his person, so that man's true nature, that is, his will henceforth live only on in other individuals.
Sure.
So
And keep on
that's
going.
the Eastern philosophy, the extinguishing of the ego, especially in Buddhism. That's how you free yourself, is through control or loss of the ego.
See, look at on the next page. He says, dying is the 20 is the moment of that liberation from the one-sidedness of an individuality, which does not constitute the innermost kernel of our true being, but is rather to be thought of as a kind of aberration. Now, I'm not quite sure how that ever gets introduced. I wondered what's the original sin that caused that to happen, but anyway. True original freedom again enters at this moment, which in a sense stated can be regarded as a restitutio in integrum. Boy, is my Latin bad, but I know what that means. But
Return to the former state.
But isn't he saying that idea of individuality is an aberration?
Yes.
Yes.
It's one-sidedness. Okay. It's a phenomena. All phenomena are less than full reality.
And I think it's the viewpoint that's the aberration of it, is that if we view ourselves just as individuals as opposed to, the lifetimes that came before us, that's the aberration, is that view of it.
Somewhere he talks about a turning point.
That was the collection of humanity, combination of people and machines. So that was the collective. That's what he's referring to.
He has one very interesting thing I thought was very funny. He's talking about death as being without pain, that moment of death without pain. And he says, all who have lost consciousness in water through charcoal fumes or through hanging also state, as is well known, that it happened without pain. So he's saying that someone who was hanged reported that
it's
no pain.
Well, there's some people that survived hanging.
That was funny. Well,
the drowning part of it.
With his father having committed suicide, maybe he feels comfort feeling this way.
Yeah, he could have.
Go to page 19. The first paragraph.
That's what I was
on page
reading.
19. And at the end of the paragraph, he says, everything is full of him, and there is no place where he should not be, no being in whom he would not live. For existence does not support him, but he's existence. Is he talking about God?
No, he's talking about the Lord of the world.
Now, look at the first sentence. He said, this strange and even ludicrous spectacle of the Lord of the world.
Of the world.
Right. Makes a difference.
Yes.
Major
Yes.
difference.
Yes, okay.
Okay.
But that's meant to be comforting to you, because that will never dies. It's always there, and you start out in that will and you return to it, and he calls it the womb of nature.
Jack, you used the phrase his philosophy.
Yes.
Other than the fact that we have this drive to live, this inward drive, how would you describe his philosophy other than he's very pessimistic about life?
Well, he's saying that we have this will to live, but we also have knowledge, and if we have enough knowledge, it can override the will to live, and if we see things in perspective, that we overcome our fear of death. If we see ourselves as just as a short lifetime in millions of lifetimes, then we don't fear it anymore.
Yeah, but he goes beyond fear of death as to saying it shouldn't make any difference to us whether we have existence or non-existence.
Well, yes, but it is nature's remedy. That's what he's projecting as nature's remedy. Nature gives us this consolation.
Yeah.
But the other thing is the subconscious determines all this stuff. Your consciousness is very minor. And that's...
But when he's talking about fear of death, we know that people face death and sacrifice themselves to the point of death for purposes, there are people who want to go to Mars even if they die up in Mars, right?
Sure,
there are people who sacrifice themselves for their country, for their children.
He mentions that.
What does he say about it?
Well, again, he said that knowledge, other things can override this fear of this will to live.
All knowledge does is lay out the options. And then,
well, on page 5, he talks about all this knowledge, but I don't get a clear explanation of what knowledge is. On page 5, he talks about all this
causation.
At the end,
it's understanding causation is what knowledge is for him.
And our place in the universe.
Space, time, space, and cause. He's a Kantian. Time,
don't
space,
get him
and causation.
supporting existence at all, or even seeing
No.
existence as good. He doesn't even see existence as
That's
good.
my question.
Yes.
Right?
What does the
But go to
individual
page-
add?
We live
page
moment
20.
to moment.
Page 20.
Cycle
the
to
last
cycle.
sentence.
Okay.
A bunch of vibrations if you got a far enough view.
Okay. We're running out of time. Go ahead, Bob.
He willingly gives up the existence that we know. What comes to him instead of it is, in our eyes, nothing, because our existence is reference to one that is nothing. The Buddhist faith calls the existence nirvana.
Yeah.
That is to say, extinction. If you give up the will to live, that's the biggest thing you can do. And now you're in a state of something.
You're giving up your ego is what
Yeah.
you're giving
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
Right.
You're giving up a one-sided will.
Isn't that the essence of what he's
Yeah.
saying in this whole?
Well, that's his
Yeah,
summary,
okay.
yes.
One of the things I do see in this is I see some Baruch Spinoza in here, pantheism or panentheism, if you want.
Yeah, I wonder.
That's stretching it, but maybe.
A little bit.
Well, Freud sure got his subconscious out of this because really the will, and he says it's blind and accidental and irrational, and boy, all of this Freud really took off with that. And the same thing with Nietzsche coming up with his morality based on,
Yeah.
well, ego emphasis, I guess
I think
you call it.
kind of the way we can give it our opinion. I think that
Yeah,
when he
sorry.
says that knowledge can overcome our will to live, I think knowledge and what he's talking about is not worth anything. It just doesn't work. We can all say, yeah, there's all these lives and, millions of people have lived before us and in the future and all that. And it doesn't really make a difference. But
Well,
of course
there is
it
a
does.
turning point somewhere if you see things from a higher standpoint in here, and that's when somehow you
Yeah.
see the causation of being bound in the will.
Yeah.
You get free from it.
Yeah, yeah.
But how
Well,
it
see-
happens, God knows.
Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the show. Join us next time when we discuss another great selection. As Aristotle said, the best way to learn is to get together in small groups and discuss great ideas.